Dr. Mark Goodacre, or if I may call you the Francis Hill Fox Professor. Is that okay?
Yes, sure.
Welcome to MythVision. I'm so glad that you're joining us. Your expertise in studying of the Thar hypothesis, if I'm saying that right, and that Q isn't necessary to make sense of this data, obviously is a game changer for many folks that I actually interview all the time. But there's something interesting about the Synoptic Problem that you bring into your new book. And this is dealing with Thomas. The question pretty much is, does Thomas know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Right.
If so, can you explain how he knows, and why does that even matter?
Well, it's nice of you to call it my new book, because actually it's nearly 10 years old now. and I worry all the time about my rate of productivity. So I like thinking that it's a recent book. But the thing about Thomas is, I got looking at it because when I wrote my book on Q, now nearly 20 years ago, people kept saying to me, all right, so if Q doesn't exist, how do you explain the Gospel of Thomas? Because Gospel of Thomas is, a lot of people say, similar to Q, right? It's sayings gospel, hasn't got passion story, hasn't got resurrection, anything like that. So everyone says, well, here's something just like Q. And so I thought, we've got to deal with it. So my idea of writing the book on Thomas is, how do you explain that? Where does this come from? How come we've got this sayings gospel that has all this sort of weird stuff in it? And saying weird is a bit disparaging, isn't it? But when I'm talking to my students, I sometimes say funky stuff because it sounds less disparaging. But Thomas is this really strange mix between the things that are familiar to us from the Synoptics. About half of Thomas is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptics. But the other half is new stuff. And I think one of the things that's fascinating is, could it be that Thomas got the stuff that it shares with Matthew, Mark, and Luke from Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And my argument is, yes, he did. That's exactly where he got it from. And I think it's a very particular reason why he uses that stuff.
I think scholars actually, like you said, they're like divided on this topic, but you lean with the idea that, yes, he knows these other Gospels. I recently interviewed Elaine Pagels and plan on interviewing her in person here soon. And of course, she's big on the whole Nag Hammadi and all this other stuff. She, I think, in our interview, made the point that she thinks that this may have been an actual early source. And I could see how that would impact her, even her own thinking about these texts. She thinks that there were secret teachings. Looking at Mark, there were secret... It seems like there's only the insiders get the inside information. Do you think that the Gospel of Thomas kind of like took that and ran with it?
Absolutely, yeah. The thing is, this idea of secrecy, a lot of people associate it with Mark's Gospel, but it's everywhere. Every early Christian text plays with secrecy in some way. And there's a very obvious reason why they did this. Because if you think of the story of Jesus, it's a story about somebody who people were celebrating as a Messiah, as a Son of God, and all the rest of it, but only this tiny group of people knew about him. This tiny group of people in a place that loads of people have never even heard of. So you're in Rome, and you say, oh, the Son of God has come, and I think, oh, great, where did he come to? Oh, this outpost out in Judea. All right, Judea. Where did he come from? He was born. It was called Jesus of Nazareth. Nazareth. What's Nazareth? Never heard of Nazareth. So all early Christians have got this difficult message to convey, and so what they said is, well, he kind of hid himself a bit. So there was not everybody knew. There were people specially chosen. So you get this secrecy message comes in very, very early on. And some people say, oh, John's Gospel, that hasn't got a secret Messiah. Well, it has. You read John's Gospel, what does Jesus keep doing? He goes and he hides himself several times. And so what they did, I actually think this lies behind the whole idea of writing a Gospel, that if you're going to say that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah, is the Son of God, and so on, you actually have to find a way of explaining that. So what you do is you say, well, people only really fully realize who he was after the resurrection. So that gets built into the story. So in a way, all Gospels are kind of retrospective retrospective ways of working out who Jesus really was. And it's like saying, even though it might seem like a strange story, I can guarantee that he really is the Son of God, the Messiah, and so on. So to bring it back to Thomas, Thomas then plays on this whole secrecy thing, Because one of your problems is, if you come up with a new gospel, I think Thomas has written somewhere in the sort of early to middle 2nd century. If you come up with this new gospel, it's the same way if I just arrive today and say, oh, I've just discovered this new Leonardo da Vinci, you're going to be, oh, come on, where do you... If I say I found it in the attic, you say, did you? Did you know?
Right.
So Thomas comes up with this new gospel, and, he says, I've got this new gospel. People are going to say, what are you talking about? I mean, how come this... he says, because these are the secret sayings. These are the secret ones. Only Thomas knew about these. Jesus whispered things in Thomas's ear. That's what Thomas 13 says. Jesus whispered things in his ear. So what happens is Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, uses the idea of secrecy to say, we have these things that people didn't previously know about Jesus, and now I'm letting you know the real juicy stuff. So secrecy is a key thing then, also in all these 2nd century Gospels like Thomas, I think.
It's almost like an advertising, so to speak. I don't mean it in business sense, because this is obviously a very important movement. But it's like, psychologically, who doesn't want to know, shh, I've got a mystery.
Right, exactly.
Everyone wants to
exactly.
know, don't tell anyone. And you kind of see this, an example, I'm not necessarily making the Homeric connection that Dennis does, even though I love listening to his ideas. Whether they're actually the case is another question. But the idea of like, here you have Odysseus going, shh, don't tell him it's me. There's a mystery there, but he really capitalized on that. And some of the points I'd like to maybe ask about the Gospel of Thomas, since you really delved deep into this author is saying the resurrection happened. Not like Jesus is the first fruits. It's not a Pauline, like, he's the first fruits of it. We're all going to get new bodies. No, look around, Thomas. Look around to the other disciples, and it's already happened. The repose of the dead has taken place. That does, for me, that's hard to say that's early. That's even hard to say that that's around the exact time of any of the first synoptics. Now, John, I am the resurrection, Jesus says. So it seems realized eschatology. Can you maybe touch on some of that a little?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the thing with Thomas is it introduces itself as the secret sayings of the living Jesus, right? And that word, the living one, is really key. Do you know, one of the first time that we see that phrase, the living one, occurring in reference to Jesus is in Luke's resurrection story. It's a great line, famous line. The angel says to the women, why are you seeking the living one among the dead? Why are you seeking, we always translate it, why do you seek the living among the dead? Because that's got a nice poetic ring, but it's the living one, same phrase as in Thomas. So Thomas kind of presupposes, begins the story where Luke ends his story. So the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas, he doesn't even have to go through death. He's already the living one right from the beginning. That's how they characterize him. That's how Thomas thinks about things. He doesn't want to think of this passion resurrection story like kind of episodes in a life. He just presented with this figure, this talking head. And actually, there are a bunch of other Gospels, not exactly the same as Thomas, but there's a bunch of other Gospels that have similar motifs. Quite often, they will actually situate the story post-resurrection. So the resurrected Jesus appears and just starts talking to people, right? So you've got things like the Gospel of Mary, which seems to be a post-resurrection dialogue where Jesus turns up and he's talking variously to Mary and different people. So this idea of playing with who Jesus is and the resurrection and whether he's living or not is, well, he's always living, but in what respect he's living. Those things are always absolutely key.
Thomas is something else. I ask everyone to obviously go get this book of yours because it hinges on this very important problem of the synoptics. And I guess asking in light of this, how has that book been received by scholarship? Not just the general populace, because I don't know how much of the general populace has said, I want to go read that book because it's highly technical information.
Right. If you have problems with insomnia, then I mean, I do think it's nice of you to ask me about my own work. I mean, if I had a chance to review my own stuff, I think it's my best book, the Thomas book, but it won't be my most important book because I think that's always going to be the thing on Q because more people care about Q than care about Thomas. So even though I think the Thomas book is a better book, I think the Q book has actually in a way been more important in scholarship. It's been pretty well reviewed by scholars actually. I was very pleasantly surprised. One scholar, Nicola Denzi-Lewis, talked about it being a quiet revolution, she said. In other words, if you start seeing Thomas as interacting with other early Christian Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it does change the way you think of Thomas. Because if you think of Thomas as being like early, independent, autonomous, then it's doing its own thing in kind of a vacuum. And I actually don't think that's how most early Christians worked. I think they were in networks. They talked to one another. And that means that they actually passed their text around. And one Christian would go from one area to another. We know that they were traveling a bit. So they go to somebody else's church or gathering or house, and then they hear some new gospel they've not heard before. They're like, hell, I'm going to send someone get a copy of it. Can I send my scribe over, my slave, to take a copy? And they go, yeah, sure, So they take a copy back with them, and that's how the texts start traveling around, So I can't remember what we were. Oh yeah, how was it received? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the thing is, the way that the book's been received has, a lot of people have said, okay, so if we're bringing Thomas into conversation with other texts like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that changes the way we read it. I think it makes it more interesting, because I think it's always more interesting to watch the way that different early Christian communities are interacting with one another. And you obviously haven't got access to that except through texts. So what you do is you look at the text, you look at the works and say, has this work bounced off this one, bounced off this one? And I actually think you can do the whole thing quite organically. I think you have Mark's gospel, it's kind of this raw work of brutish genius. Matthew sees Mark, loves it, but thinks he can do better, right?
Right.
So he rewrites it, copying tons of it out, trying to sort of absorb it into his own gospel and rewrite it. Luke then comes along, sees Matthew, realises what Matthew's done, and goes, I could do that, but I can do it better. So I'm going to fix Mark too, but I'm going to use some of this new stuff from Matthew. So he also tries to fix Mark. Then John comes along and he goes, do you know what? I really need to kind of get to the heart of who this Jesus really was. And so he does a kind of complete reimagination, almost like he's rebooting the whole thing. So he knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but he's kind of rebooting them a bit. And then you get Thomas, and he's bouncing off them all, but in a completely different way, saying, do you know what? I'm going to home in on these sayings, and I'm actually going to use the familiar sayings as a means of kind of giving authority and legitimation to the newer, funkier stuff that I'm going to add to it, right? So I think that all of these people knew one another's text. Well, not one another's text, but Mark gives birth to Matthew, gives birth to Luke, gives birth to John. And I think it actually works like that. And then Thomas bouncing off those, and so on for lots of other early Christian texts. People react to things. They see a text and they think, I love it, but I can write something better, right?
Right.
Someone else will get hold of it and say, I don't like this, I'm going to overwrite that. And you can see that within the canon, and you can see it outside of the canon as well. People constantly bouncing off one another.
This begs the question, two questions kind of in the vein. One's probably simple, yes or no, and the other one I'd love to hear your thoughts on. Was the Gospel of Thomas Gnostic, number one, and what that means? Maybe you can give us a little, because there's this huge debate right now, like, is it Gnosticism a thing, right? And that's, I don't want to open the can of worms, but maybe you can touch it. And then, do you think that Gnosticism, or if this is something proto like it or whatever, is this trying to solve maybe a failed apocalypse and saying the imagined reality of what was expected, you guys were wrong. It's something else. It's spiritual. It's Platonic maybe. It's maybe you can...
We can actually, with the whole question of is Thomas Gnostic or not, it's actually very easy, I think, to unravel it. If you ask a more basic question, what does the term Gnostic mean? It means like somebody who is interested in knowledge, right?
Right.
The Greek word gnosis is knowledge. So, is the Gospel of Thomas interested in knowledge? Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. And what's more, it thinks that knowledge is more important than faith. There's actually a moment where the disciples come to Jesus, they start talking to Jesus about faith, and Jesus responds in terms of knowledge, right? So we can actually sweep to one side, Gnosticism, Gnostics, blah, blah. Is Thomas interested in knowledge? Yes, he's much more interested in knowledge than he is in faith, right? So you then have to say, well, knowledge of what? And the answer is, it's all about knowledge of whom, because what it is it's about knowing Jesus and his sayings, understanding Jesus' sayings, investigating Jesus' sayings, and in the process of doing that, becoming like Jesus, right? So it's not having faith in Jesus so much as it's becoming like Jesus and having the knowledge of the things that he has too. It's actually, I mean, going back again to the sort of question of mysteries again, it's what Thomas is basically saying is, I am going to reveal to you a mystery, which is something which, of course, much religious literature does. And a bit of a sweeping statement, I know, but that's what religious literature does. It says, I'm going to tell you a mystery. I'm going to tell you the answer to these problems, right? And Thomas is doing that just like anybody else is.
Apocalypse. I guess I double whammied you, and that was the first one was a really loaded, important thing for you to address. So, do you think that this knowledge-based teaching is trying to get away from apocalyptic messianic expectation of fulfillment?
Yes. I mean, if one thing's clear about the Gospel of Thomas, it's that it really is not interested in the idea of a forthcoming dramatic apocalypse. So Thomas doesn't think that the kingdom of God is about to dawn any minute. So Mark's Gospel, Mark 9:1, some of those standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power, right? So it's imminent, it's going to come with power, you're going to be able to see it. That's the whole message of not just Mark, but Matthew and Luke, and to some extent John as well, although John will keep to one side for a second. But then you get to Thomas. Thomas wouldn't have any of that. You have knowledge, absolutely, like an internal knowledge, replacing this idea of some crashing outer reality that's going to kind of take over everything. So one of the sayings that Thomas really, really likes from Luke, in Luke 17, Jesus talks about the kingdom of God being within you or among you. It's very difficult to translate because it's as weird in Greek as it is in English.
Wow.
And in fact, when I was writing the book on it, there's this marvelous thing called the TLG, where you can go and search for through all Greek literature. And I looked for that phrase in Greek, entos humon in Greek, among you, within you, something like that. First time that phrase ever comes in Greek literature is in Luke 17 and at the beginning of Gospel of Thomas, right? So I think Thomas sees this weird thing in Luke and runs with it. Because Thomas basically wants to say, the kingdom of God is not this external reality that is going to come and take over everyone's life in this big apocalyptic transformation of the world. It's all going to happen inside. It's all going to be within you. So he likes that little saying in Luke 17 and he runs with it and really works with that sort of idea of things. So yes, I absolutely agree. The Gospel of Thomas replaces an apocalyptic worldview with a kind of interior knowledge that's how the kingdom of God will be realized in people.
There's so much more we could talk about with this book. So then I guess the final question pertaining to Thomas, and everyone needs to go get the book, I can't recommend it enough, is would you say, I just lost the thought. It was so powerful too.
Yeah.
It was so good. You know when you have that thought and you're like, okay, this is it.
Happens to me all the time, in teaching especially. I'll go, and the nice thing when you're teaching is you can say, someone help me out, what was I talking about? And someone will go, you were just, thank you, you know.
Just remembered. So would you say there's more Hellenistic influence on this inner teaching knowledge thing? This is not necessarily coming out of a purely Messianic Judaism type world, but there's some messing with maybe Stoicism or someone else has kind of influenced a Hellenistic Judaism has caused Thomas to keep going in that route? Or?
I think one thing you can say is that when you read the Gospel of Thomas, it is less obviously rooted in the same kind of Jewish / Galilean / Judean matrix that the Synoptic Gospels and John are rooted in. Just to take something really, really simple, geography. You read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all the way through, you get references to Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Capernaum, Chorazin, Bethsaida, all of these kind of just places that we know actually existed, right? When you get to Thomas, what have you got? Barely anything. You get a Judean mentioned one time, and you get a Samaritan mentioned one time, and that's it, right? So you don't have Nazareth, Capernaum, Jerusalem. You don't have all of those kind of really specific places. So Thomas has moved out of that ambit. And I think equally, you can then ask the question, what's Thomas's attitude to the Hebrew Bible, to the Old Testament? Whereas in the Synoptics and John, you keep getting quotations from the Old Testament. Isaiah quoted all the time, constantly. Psalms are quoted. You get references to characters, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, just all the way through the Gospels. They're trying to say Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. Then you get to the Gospel of Thomas. Where does Moses come? Never. Isaiah? Never. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? Not mentioned. Do you know the only Old Testament character mentioned in the Gospel of Thomas is Adam? first man. And that is typical of other Gnostic, and there's that word Gnostic again.
Yeah.
It's typical of other Gnostic texts that they begin with Adam, and they retell the story of the Garden of Eden. They don't want to they don't want to talk about Moses. They don't want to talk about the patriarchs. They want to go right back to the beginning, to Genesis, and that's where they will begin retelling the story. So yes, Thomas is in a slightly different world from the world of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, there's overlap, but it's moving into doing something a little bit different, definitely.
I have so many more questions, and I want to leave everyone on a cliffhanger because the Gospel of Thomas is interesting, but I think it's far more interesting getting someone who knows the original languages, who's an expert in this research, to hear you and then others, of course, give their insights on why they think the way they do. So I really appreciate you answering those questions.
That's all a pleasure.